There we go. All right, we are in Mark chapter 7. You remember last week we did the first 23 verses of Mark 7. This is where Jesus was dealing with the Pharisees and the scribes, and they were talking to Jesus about what it means to be clean. Remember, his disciples eat with unwashed hands, and Jesus told them that they were going too far, basically. Remember, he told them that God didn't command that, but they were requiring that of the other Jews, and so he told them that wasn't a fair assessment, basically. And he talked about how they were more about what you do than the reason you do it. And that's sort of what we're going to see. And we're going to see a sort of a continuation of that tonight. And you remember that Mark tells us right before these verses is that Jesus made it where there was no longer clean and unclean to eat and such to worry about. And we realize that because when we go to church and we talk about church and things we're supposed to do today, that's not something we talk about. We don't talk about what animals we're supposed to eat, what animals we're not supposed to eat. Matter of fact, if you look at what was clean and unclean at their time, a lot of the food we eat, we wouldn't be able to eat now. Like anything we eat that's pork, most of your barbecue, bacon, sausage, pork chops, any of that stuff, you couldn't eat that. That's an unclean animal. And I don't know how many of y'all do it, but maybe your parents do, of eating catfish. Catfish were considered unclean animals because they didn't have scales. And that's just two examples of more that show us what was there. And I will say that to say this, in that what we're seeing here is Jesus is introducing what he's about to change. And he's not going to introduce that change in the book of Mark, but he's going to introduce that change in the book of Acts. And that is the change of the old law, the old covenant to the new. And that is the church. The idea of clean and unclean as far as animals and people has sort of disappeared and has been removed. And now he is going to open this up for all people. And that's what we're going to see tonight because Jesus is going to go to some places that we wouldn't expect him to go to. So let's get into our text tonight in verse 24. Verse 24, and from there he arose and went away to the region of Tyre and Sidon. And he entered a house and did not want anyone to know, yet he could not be hidden. But immediately a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit heard of him and came and fell down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth, and she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And he said to her, let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. But she answered him, yes, Lord, yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. And he said to her, for this statement you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter. And she went home and found the child lying in bed and the demon gone. So we get this very interesting interaction here between Jesus and this woman. Now, again, this is another thing that's unusual to us is that Jesus, in their time, the interaction of male and female was not like it is today. In their time, if you were a female and you were of a certain age, and I think all the girls in here tonight are of that age, you would have to start wearing a veil. You would have to wear a veil that would cover your whole face, and it would cover, the only thing you could see was your eyes. And when you were in public, unless a man spoke to you and addressed you, you were not to say a word. And you were not to be in the presence of another man unless it was your father, your brother, or some kind of kinfolk, close kinfolk, or your husband. Those are the only ones. And the other interesting about it is the girls in this class tonight, y'all may not understand this at your time, is that y'all would have been of the marrying age at this point. And it wouldn't have been like it was today. It would have been where you would have been, you didn't choose your spouse, your parents would have chose your spouse for you. And so this is a few things that are a little different. So I want you to get the point of the time sitting here. But Jesus leaves Galilee. If you look at Jerusalem and where Jesus usually is, that's in the south. He's been in Galilee. Galilee's north. From here, he travels another 50 miles north. He travels 50 miles north of Galilee, north of Israel, or north of Nazareth, excuse me, to the land, the cities of Tyre and Sidon. And he goes to Gentile cities. This is the first time we see Jesus, about the only time really we see Jesus leave the promised land. He leaves Israel and goes to this northern region and goes up here to teach. And this would have been unheard of because, again, we talked about this. The typical Jew, and again, the typical Jew in their thought was that you didn't go into a Gentile land. As a matter of fact, well, the Jews had this idea that if they walked into a Gentile land, when they came out of that land, before they crossed into their home country, they would take their sandals and they would they would knock the dust off of them. We talked about that when Jesus sends out his disciples and the town doesn't receive them, to knock the dust off your shoes. Well, that's where that comes from. Is that they would go, and when they were getting ready to go back into the promised land, they would dust their shoes off. They'd get their shoes off because they didn't want any of the pagan dirt to get into the promised land, to their hometown. And so this is very unusual for Jesus to go up here north, but this shows us some foreshadowing, if you will, in literary terms, of seeing what's about to happen, is that Jesus is about to do away with those Old Testament ideas, that Old Testament teaching about Jew and Gentile division. And we see that that the Jews themselves at the time of Jesus have taken that teaching a little too far, in that they don't believe, or they believe that if you weren't exactly a Jew like they were, more likely just if you weren't a born Jew, you weren't going to be saved. You were not part of God's people. So he goes into this northern country, and he goes into a house. And this is interesting, is that Jesus goes into most likely a Gentile house. Now, this is something else that's interesting, is that typical Jews of Jesus' day, they didn't go into the house of a Gentile. They considered themselves to be unclean if they entered into that house. And so Jesus goes into the Gentile's house. And he does this, some other places it's hinted at that he may do this. But he goes into a house, and he goes this far off place to get away. Notice, he did not want anyone to know he was there. He did not want to prophesy or let it be proclaimed, that he was in the region, that he was here. And the reason for that is because he's not going to preach to these people. And this is what's different about what happens here, is in the Jewish lands, we will see Jesus preaching and healing. Here, we only see Jesus healing. He doesn't do a lot of preaching. And the reason that is because the Jews are the ones who have this message, and his apostles are not yet to the point of realizing what's going to happen. It's really not until Acts 10, where you see the story of Cornelius, that Peter's finally going to dawn on him that God's gospel is for everyone, that God's word, God's kingdom is for all people. And so the disciples are gathered into a house, and as they're in that house, verse 25, a woman comes in. A woman with a little daughter, it says here, a young girl, and she has a demon. Now, exactly what this demon does, we don't know. There's a lot of different ideas of different things that could have done, but she came, and she has this daughter who apparently is in bed quite a bit. She has this demon that we've seen demons do all kinds of things to these people. And she comes down and she falls down at Jesus' feet. She bows down before him and she cries out to him. Now, verse 26, Mark wants us to know for sure, that this woman was a Gentile. This is not a Jew living in a Gentile nation. She is a Gentile, full-born Gentile, Syro-Phoenician. That tells you where she's at. That's sort of her nationality by birth. She has been born in this region of Sidon, and in the region of Tyre, and of the Phoenician kingdom. And so she comes and she begs him. Now, the idea here, begging, is also carried across in Matthew. I think Matthew 15 will talk about the same interaction. And it'll say there that this woman was begging Jesus and his apostles. And the word used there by Matthew for begging is shouting. She was crying and yelling, trying to get their attention. That she was begging them to do something. And she falls out at Jesus' feet and she begs him to cast out this demon. No, because she knows he's the only one who can do this. And so she begs him. And so the next verse is a very interesting verse because we get an interesting reaction from Jesus. In verse 27, Jesus said to her, "Little children, let the little children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." Now, what Jesus is saying here is he's doing a few things. One, let me tell you how they did it. What this children's bread is talking about, throwing it to the dogs. In a rich household in the first century, when you had your meal and your meal was over, if you needed to wipe your hands, you didn't wipe it on a towel. You didn't wipe it on paper towels. They didn't have that. What you would do is they had bread that they would cook, special bread that they'd have pieces of. And they would use this bread to wipe their hands with. They'd clean their hands on this bread. And then this bread would be given to the dogs. You would give it to dogs, or depending on where your social status, your children may be given that bread to eat from the parents with the leftover. And that's typically how it worked. The parents would eat, then the children would eat, and then you give the rest to the dogs. And so this is the bread he's talking about, bread that the parents would have had left over that they cleaned their hands with. They gave it to the children, and the children would eat. And then after children ate, the dogs would eat. And so Jesus says, let the children be fed first. Now, the children in this parable, in this saying, is the Jews. He says, let the Jewish people, God's children, be fed first. They were God's chosen nation. They were the children of God. And he says that they deserve the right to be fed first. And then he says, again, for it's not right to take the children's bread, the children's food, and throw it to the dogs. Now, to us, when we read that for the first time, or maybe the second time, without looking at the idea, the context, and learning history a little bit, that doesn't sound, we're not sure about what that means about throw it to the dogs. Well, when you look at the Jewish history and look at how they treated other people, in a Jewish man's eyes, and most Jews at Jesus' time's eyes, because they viewed themselves as being the children of God and everyone else being not the children of God, they would commonly call Gentiles dogs. They would call other people, they would view them as a dog. And I'm not talking about man's best friend either. You see, that's a difference. Our world is totally different. We have dogs and they're man's best friend. We take care of that dog. We feed that dog. We do everything we can for that dog. In their world, very rarely do people actually have dogs as pets. Dogs were scavengers. If you've had a dog and you got an outside dog, you probably had this. You ever had a day, well, maybe not you, but your parents are grumbling and complaining because the dog got in the trash? You put the trash can out, the dogs knock it over, and they rip the trash bags up, and they spread the trash everywhere because they're trying to find food. Well, in the ancient world, that's what the dogs were known for. They were scavengers. They would go and they would eat the junk out of the alleyways. They'd eat the junk in the hallways, in the pathways. They would go and they would scavenge whatever they could. And so dogs were not looked very kindly upon, except in certain houses. And then there were some houses they were looked upon, but they were still not treated like they were for us. And in those houses, you would feed a dog. And so what Jesus is basically saying is that the Israelites deserve his care, not the Gentiles, because the Israelites, the Jews, are God's children, not the Gentiles. And so Jesus asked this woman this question. Again, this sounds very rude and very odd for Jesus to say this, and it is very odd for Jesus to say this, because Jesus, so far, every time he's seen someone in need, he helps someone, without question, without slowing down. So why does he ask this question here? Well, he asks this question here or he makes a statement here, I should say, not this question. He makes a statement here to prove a point. He's going to test this woman. He's trying to see what this woman will say. In verse 28, this woman responds in the best way she can. Verse 28, she answers, "Yes, Lord." Yes, you're right, Jesus. "Yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." You see, this woman makes a very bold statement, and that she admits, and she says, yes, in your people's eyes, I'm a dog. I am not a child of yours. I'm not a part of your chosen nation. I am a dog. And she says, yet the dogs get to eat the crumbs. The dogs get the pieces that fall in the floor. You see, what this woman is doing is she's showing her humility. She's showing her love. And that she was willing to admit that Jesus is right, that she's not a child of his. She's not a member of the Jewish nation. She doesn't deserve Jesus' care. But she's asking for it anyway, because even the dogs deserve some sympathy. And then Jesus responds to her. He says, for this statement, you may go your way. Basically, he's saying, you answered right. Now, it's not to say Jesus thought she was a dog, but Jesus was testing her to see if she would let her pride get in the way. Her pride get in the way, like we see in the Old Testament, Naaman, when Elijah tells him to go dip in the Jordan, and Naaman says, no, I'm not going in that dirty river. Then later he says, maybe I ought to go. His servants convinced him to go. Same is true here. This woman could have got mad. If you call me a dog, I'm not going to be here. But no, this woman says, if that's what you think, yes, that's true. But even dogs deserve sympathy. Even dogs deserve care. They deserve food. And then Jesus says, go your way. Your faith, and that's basically what this idea is, your statement, your faith has made this girl well. And that she was willing to be insulted. She was willing to be put down in order to give her daughter what she needs. And you notice he says, the demons left your daughter. And then in verse 30, she goes home. And when she gets home, she finds her child lying in bed and a demon gone. The girl is lying in bed because she's exhausted. Now, you remember earlier in one of the stories a few chapters ago, we had the girl that Jesus raises from the dead. And remember, he tells them to give her something to eat because she's exhausted. She's famished. That's the idea here. This girl has been battling this demon for we don't know how long. And as soon as this demon is gone, she's exhausted. She's resting. She's trying to recuperate. But the woman comes back and she sees her faith that Jesus is only able to cast out this demon. But notice, he does it at a distance. He does it from far away because he's not at her house. We don't know where she lives. We don't know how close she is to where Jesus is at. Just that she's heard he's here and she comes. That's the first story tonight. The first encounter of Jesus, first miracle he does. The next miracle we're going to look at happens in verse 31 and going to the end of the chapter. Verse 31, and then he returned from the region of Tyre and went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. And they brought him to a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment. And they begged him to lay his hand on him. And taking him aside from the crowd privately, he put his fingers into his ears, and after spitting, touched his tongue. And looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephphatha, meaning, that is, be opened. And his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. And Jesus charged him to tell no one. But the more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. And they were astonished beyond measure, saying, he has done all things well. He makes even the deaf hear and the mute speak. So let's go back to the first part, verse 31. Jesus leaves the region of Tyre and Sidon. Now, what we see here is the last verse, verse 24, the last section verses. Jesus went up to Tyre and Sidon. From Sidon, he goes in, or from Tyre, he goes into Sidon. He goes even further north. And then he makes a round trip back to the Sea of Galilee. And he makes a trip. Most Bible scholars think that this trip probably lasted 8 months to a year. That for 8 months to a year, Jesus was making this trip in a Galilee nation, and then he come back. And when he comes back in the region of the Decapolis. Now, if you'll remember, we've heard that word before. I believe it's chapter 5, where we talked about the man who was possessed by the legion. Remember the demons that were cast out into the pigs and they stormed down the hill? That man lived in the region of the Decapolis. He lived there, and he was told to go preach to those people. Go tell them about who Jesus was and about what Jesus had did for him. And that word, now remember that word Decapolis again, means 10 cities. So Jesus is back in that area. Now, this is another area where there's a Gentile presence. And what's thought is that this man that they bring to Jesus may have been a Gentile as well. He may not have been a Jew. And so they bring this man to Jesus. And it's a very interesting thing that he does here of why he acts this way. And we'll talk about why he acted this way in a minute. But notice they bring to him a man who is deaf and had a speech impediment. So they bring to him a man who's deaf. He cannot hear. And apparently this deaf has been from his birth on. And that's the idea too. They had a speech impediment. He couldn't speak plainly. Some translations say he stuttered. The idea here is very common even today, is that if you see or come into contact with someone who's been deaf from birth, and even when you watch TV, when you hear them speak, if they're able to speak, they may not be the clearest of speakers. They have trouble with their words. Well, the reason for that is because they can't hear. When we are growing up, just like with Austin and Elizabeth, when they hear words, they're able to repeat them. Well, if you're not able to hear the words, but you're able to read it and you don't know how it sounds, you have a very hard time speaking very clearly, speaking plainly. And so this is what this guy is. This guy is deaf, and he's not able to speak well. And so they come to Jesus and they beg him, lay your hand on him, heal him, heal this man and make him well. And in verse 33, we see Jesus takes this man to the side. He takes this man over away from the crowd and goes to him privately. And again, I think this is because Jesus is going to do this miracle, but he doesn't want everyone to see what he's about to do. He doesn't want people to come in and go overabundance of what he's about to occur. And what Jesus does, he takes his hands, and this is where for a little while I tried to figure this out, and I was reading something, and it sort of explained this and made a little sense. Is that Jesus takes him to the side, and notice says he puts his fingers into his ears. And what people think Jesus does here, why Jesus does that, it's nowhere else does Jesus have to touch the ears to heal them. But what Jesus does, what Jesus is trying to accomplish here, is he's trying to tell this man what he's about to do. He takes his hand and he sticks him in his ear to let this man know he's fixing to do something to where he can hear. And then notice that, and after spitting, he touched his tongue. The idea is he spit on his hand, on his fingers, and touched the man's tongue. Now that sounds very odd to us, very gross. But in the ancient world, they thought that saliva was medicine. That's why when you read the story of the rich man Lazarus, it talks about Lazarus being on the side of the road and with sores on him, and the dogs would come and lick him. Well, that's because they believed that dogs had a healing property to them. That dog spit, that dog licking was a healing thing. And so when Jesus spits on this man and his fingers and his hand and touches this man's tongue, Jesus is telling him, I'm about to make you well. He tells him, I'm about to do something major. I'm about to take care of you. Because again, this guy cannot hear. Exactly what he can understand, we don't know. And again, remember, they didn't have the fancy sign language like we have. They didn't have all the paper that was easily to write on and those kind of things. So it's probably very difficult to communicate with this man. And so Jesus is trying to point out what he's going to do. He's pointing to his ears, and then he touches his tongue. And then we see what he does. In verse 34, Jesus looks up to heaven. He looks up and he sighs. He makes a motion. Well, you may say, well, why does he sigh here? In all the other accounts of Jesus' healing, we don't hear about this, him sighing. Why does he make a sigh? Well, I think he does this as a sign to this man, because this man is not blind. This man can see Jesus, and blind people have learned, or not blind, deaf people have learned to read lips. As a matter of fact, if you talk to anybody who has a hard time hearing, especially now with these masks we're having to wear, they'll say they have a harder time because they read lips. Well, they read lips, they read faces, they read your emotions. And so Jesus sighs, he lets an emotion out that lets this man know that something major is about to happen. And then Jesus speaks. He speaks to this man and he says, Ephphatha. Now, Ephphatha is a Aramaic word, a Hebrew word, that is, be open. He tells the man's ears to be open, his tongue to be loosed. And you notice, as soon as Jesus says it, now here's the interesting thing about this. We talked about this yesterday in the sermon, if you paid attention, that one of the interesting things about creation is that when God says something, it happened in creation. God said, let there be light, let there be firmament, let there be animals. All those things God spoke and it happened. Here you have Jesus recreating that. And the same thing happens when Jesus speaks and Jesus says this happened, it happens. And so he speaks, be open, and his ears release and his ears open, his tongue's released. He's able to talk, he's able to hear. And then when they do this, this man is amazed. And you can imagine that for a minute. I don't know if you've ever known anybody who has a hard time hearing, or maybe be deaf, and maybe has a very hard time speaking. Someone you know that has a noticeable speech impediment. Imagine how it would be to one day see somebody come up to that person, take them off to the side to talk to them, and then they come back and they talk like me and you. They talk with no problem. They talk with no issues. That has to be an amazing, wonderful thing to behold. And these people see it, and they don't know what to think. They don't know what to say. And Jesus tells them, now look, listen, don't tell anybody. Don't go spread word about this. Don't go and tell people what I've done. You just go home and live your normal life. Now, some people have said, well, maybe Jesus does this because he knows what they're about to do. Well, no, I don't think so. I think Jesus does this because he doesn't want to be known as a miracle worker. He doesn't want to be known as someone who does miracles. He wants to be known as a man who preaches a message. a man who has a purpose, a man who is the Son of God. And so they tells them, don't tell anyone, this crowd that brought this man to them. And he knows, but the more he charged them, the more he said, don't tell them. And this is not just that group, but every group he heals. He says, now look, don't tell anybody. Don't go reveal this. The more he tells them not to tell it, the more they go proclaim it. The more they go and tell everybody, hey, you've got to see this guy. And you can understand that. We all know people who have physical ailments, who are sick, who are hurting, who are deaf, who are blind, who are lame, who may be in a wheelchair. If you knew a guy who was able to heal them, don't you think you would go and tell that person and his family, hey, look, you need to go see this guy. You need to go talk to this guy. You need to go let him heal you. And if that guy told you, now look, don't tell anybody what I'm doing. Don't tell anybody about what's happening here. We need to keep this quiet. I don't need a big show. Do you think people are going to listen to that versus what he's doing? And that's what happens here. Jesus is telling them to be quiet, but Jesus, the people are telling it more and more because they're amazed at this. They want everyone to see it and everyone to know it. And then you notice verse 37, they were astonished beyond measure. They were amazed at what Jesus did. It took them back. There was no way they could answer what Jesus had done. No way they could comprehend it. And then they were all saying these things. He has done all things well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. You see, in the miracles in the Bible, until Jesus came, one of the things we don't read about in the Old Testament happening is Jesus is God doing any miracles where the deaf are able to hear, the mute are able to speak. Yes, we read about some miracles, but very few healing miracles in the Old Testament. But yet Jesus is able to do healing miracles. And again, it is not like a doctor. That's the thing I want you to get in your head. It's not like a doctor. It's not like some quote unquote miracle healers today who try to heal someone, try to do something, and it takes a couple of times. It takes a little work, or they tell you to wait. It'll eventually get there. No, when Jesus did these things, immediately it happened. Now, there's one case where that doesn't happen. I think it happens for a reason. We'll talk about it in a few weeks. It happens here in Mark. I believe it's Mark 9. But for the most part, when Jesus healed somebody, it immediately happened. And people didn't know how to take that. They didn't know how to answer that. Well, we find out this thing where they say he makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. This is a fulfillment of a prophecy of Isaiah, where Isaiah prophesied that the Messiah, the Son of God, the one who would come and establish his kingdom, would be one that makes the blind see, the deaf hear, and the mute speak. And so here we see Mark again giving us examples, giving us stories, accounts of Jesus fulfilling these prophecies, fulfilling this word that he was going to be the Son of God, or that he was the Son of God, that he was the Messiah. Now, real quickly, I want to go back because I missed something in one of these early ones, I believe. No, I take it back. In Matthew's account. In Matthew's account of the woman that brings her daughter, she calls him Son of David. She calls Jesus Son of David. Well, Son of David was a term for Messiah. So this shows us that this woman, although she wasn't a Jew, although she admits she's not a Jew, although she admits she doesn't need the bread that the Jews are supposed to be having, the bread of life, she still admits that he's the Messiah. An admission that a lot of the Jews won't make. An admission that a lot of Jews won't take. And yet here we see Jesus going to people who are not his own people. They're not the Israel. They're not the children of Israel, the lost sheep he's been sent to. Yet he went to these people. He healed them and he took care of them just as he did everybody else. And that shows us and that teaches us something about Jesus. That shows us what he's going to do, and that his gospel, his salvation, his love, his mercy, his grace is for all people, no matter if they deserve it or not. And the key thing is, none of us deserve it. None of us deserve that grace, but it's given to us freely if we'll come to him, if we'll have faith, like that Syrophoenician woman. The faith that Jesus would do something, the faith that this man that was blind and or deaf and mute, and yet Jesus was able to heal him because of the faith of the people around him. They had faith that what Jesus said he could do, and he accomplished it. Thank you again for joining us tonight. I think we may be a little shorter than usual, but we finished chapter 7 a little earlier. Take it back. We're not done earlier. But appreciate you being here tonight. I will tell you, next week, We will not have class, meaning it's week of Christmas. We're going to take that week off to let y'all have a free week and enjoy your time off. We'll let you know the week after when we're going to get back together. We should be back together the Monday after that, and we'll get it picked back up in March 8th. Mark 8th, the week after Christmas. But again, appreciate you being here. We hope you're all having a good week. Hope everything's going well, and we hope to see you next time.